So let me tell you first, The Leftover Woman is about two mothers, two worlds, and one impossible choice. It's about what happens when a young woman in China gives birth and is told shortly afterwards that her baby had died. However, she finds out a few years later that her daughter had not passed away, but had been placed for adoption by her no-good husband to a wealthy American couple. And when the novel opens, Jasmine, the biological mother, has followed her baby daughter to New York City to try to get her back. The book is told from two points of view, from that of Jasmine, the biological mother's, and from that of Rebecca, the adoptive mother, who has a high-powered career in publishing. This is also an insider look at publishing, a handsome husband, a beautiful home, and an adopted Chinese daughter she adores. So the book is an impossible situation. And most people, indeed, when they ask who did you identify with, why did you write this book, they assume that I identify most with Jasmine, the immigrant mother, which in many ways is true. I think that Jasmine is very much based on my own upbringing in a really male-dominated, old-fashioned family, which loved me very much, but where it was very clear that boys were preferred and boys were better, and boys were what we all lived to become, basically was the underlying message. But in The Leftover Woman, I also do identify very much with Rebecca, who is white but is a Harvard grad like I am, and who is a woman trying to juggle all these balls of being a mother, a wife, a daughter, a career woman, and feeling constantly like she falls short. So there's very much of me in both of the narrators in this novel.
Now, transnational adoption between the US and China has become more rare, quite more rare in recent years for a number of reasons. And also, of course, China's one-child policy was basically eased a number of years ago. Did you write the book kind of, with this being kind of a certain time period of history in mind, recognizing that it's, not a pattern that's likely to become more common in the future?
Yes, of course. I mean, the thing is that every book that I write is, of course, designed, and so I wanted to write about these themes of being a woman, of being particularly an Asian woman, of sexuality and beauty, and being used for how you look, etc., etc. I thought about all that, and so I placed the book within a historical context. But even though transracial adoption has become much less common, it is something that has affected millions and millions of people, and the one-child policy has had a tremendous impact where, to this day, I think the number is something like there are 32 million more Chinese men than women. So with a 50-50 birth rate, we are missing all these millions of Chinese women. So, it is something that is so impactful, and yet there has been some nonfiction written about it, but almost nothing in fiction. Nothing that I have personally read or seen on the screen or in print. And so I thought that it was, I thought it was a dramatic and interesting situation. I also thought it's important to write about this thing that has indirectly or directly impacted so many Chinese families.
Jean, New York City is a character, of course, along with Hunter in one of your novels. And you kind of capture a lot of the kind of milieus and subcultures of New York City really well. One of the major themes in Leftover Woman is the inequality. I mean, you're writing about a world that includes, snakeheads, a kind of human smugglers, human traffickers, who are helping to get undocumented migrants into this country. A world that's very, backbreaking labor and inequality. And then you're writing about the world of kind of Manhattan parents with means. And, these worlds, of course, and many more coexist in our city. And I'm curious about that theme of inequality and how you think it's changed in New York since the time you were growing up here, since the time you were at Hunter, and now, and also how that theme plays out in your novels.
I think that's such a great question, and it is indeed something that is really in America, right? I mean, I am living in Europe now, and in Europe, the entire social system pushes you towards the middle. They don't want you to be extremely poor or bad, anything, but they also don't want you to be extremely good or wealthy. The entire tax system, societal, everything is pulling everyone towards the middle so that everyone has a pretty good life. It's one way of doing things, while here is the wild, wild west. And you can have these incredible extremes, which of course I have seen in my own life, because for those of you who don't know, I was born in Hong Kong. I came to the US when I was 5 years old, and I was incredibly poor. And we lived in an apartment in Brooklyn that was not only overrun with roaches and rats, but was not heated. Like, it did not have a working heating system. And I worked in a Chinatown clothing factory from the time I was 5. So when I was young and in this situation, it was made clear to me through my parents and my brothers that there were only 2 roads open to me in my life. I could either work in the factory and be poor my entire life, leaving as an old woman who cut thread off of the least well-paying job, or off of garments from the clothing factory, or I could try to convince some dude to marry me, and they like despaired of this option. There were like long talks about how they could never find someone willing to marry me, because I was one of those like dreamy, intellectual, nerdy kids who was always reading and clumsy and impractical and burning dumplings and hating to clean and all of those things. Well, in a Chinese family, that is not desirable. So they were like, so it was like, yeah, we're either gonna try to marry her off or she's gonna work in the factory her entire life. And I remember thinking from a very young age, I was 7 years old, I thought, these are my 2 paths. Which one am I going to choose? And I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I thought, I'm going to go to Harvard. And that was what I decided to do. And Hunter was like the first step in my path towards Harvard. And Harvard, because it was the only school my parents had ever heard of. And I knew they would give me a full ride if I could go. So these extremes are things that I have lived in my own life and that I know coexist side by side, where people do not believe that a person can have these extremes. And I go around the entire world giving talks, sometimes at very wealthy places, and almost everywhere I go, someone comes up to whisper in my ear, this was my life too. So all of the issues that occur in the book, the extremes, are ones that I have experienced and struggled with myself personally.
Well, Jean, that's so powerful, and it resonates deeply with me and very meaningfully. I also grew up in a Hong Kong, Cantonese, Chinese American working class family in Queens. First in my family to go to college, and yeah, my dad was a restaurant worker and then a taxi driver. My mom was a secretary, and my grandmother, in fact, was a thread cutter, and also a member of the Garment Workers Union, right? Like so many of our people were. So that resonates so powerfully with me. Tell us a little bit about how your literary journey began. Was that as clear? Were you on Argus? Did you do Hunter literary? Did you do Hunter literary activities? Were you a poet in high school? Did you do theater? How did you become and develop as a writer?
When I would have to say that for most of my life I was in hiding. And we all know Mr. Marinoff, right? Usually I tell the story about identifying him. Yeah, I'm going to tell you the real story here, which is that I had Mr. Marinoff, and I loved him. I admired him deeply, like, as we all do. Mr. Marinoff did not think I was that hot. He didn't like me that much. I think he thought I was okay. But I was quiet. I had been taught at home not to look people in the eyes. He liked brash, opinionated girls and boys, who were political and who spoke up for themselves. And I was like this meek little thing that couldn't even look him in the eyes. And he gave a current events quiz every day. And he said, there is no reason that any of you could fail this quiz because you need to be involved in the world. You need to know the headlines. I'm not asking you anything very difficult. It's just the headlines. And you can read your parents' newspapers, you can watch the news, you can listen to the radio. Well, there were no English newspapers in my home. I worked in a factory next to the steamers where the whistles went off every 5 minutes. And, I wasn't home to watch the news because I was working in a clothing factory. And so I failed those tests every day. And Mr. Marinoff said to me, "Why are you failing my tests?" And I lied. I just lied because I was not going to tell this man who I did not know the truth about my life. And so I think that, this idea of us living through different ways, having different sides of us, is something that is very real. So I hid my past for basically my entire life. And so at Hunter, I wanted to fit in. We had the clique in my year. I don't know how many of you had the clique, the all black artsy types who were, great, but I was like not one of them. I was not one of the cool kids. I was not artsy in the slightest. I was math, science. Because my only goal was to go to Harvard and get out of the factory. Like, I just wanted to have a job. This artsy-fartsy crap, I just was like, that's like for if you can afford it. Like, I could not afford it, and that was not something I was going to do. So I did get into Harvard. I got in early, and I went in as a physics major. And of course, having gone to Hunter, I had all the APs. I skipped a year, and I was ready to get my master's in 4 years there. I went there, and it was really one night when I was there that I was working on a problem set, pulling an all-nighter, and my hand wrote a poem. And I was like, oh my God, who is that? Like, I felt like I had laid an egg. But that was the first piece of really creative writing I ever did. And from then on, I never wanted to be anything else. So that was kind of the moment when I think deep down I understood that I wouldn't have to go back to the factory, and that I could do what I really wanted to do, which was to become a writer.
Now, had you taken any English classes, whether at Hunter or in college, that poem didn't come from nowhere, right? Like, what do you think were some of the forces that propelled that literary side of you that it took you until college to discover?
Well, I think the amazing English teachers at Hunter definitely helped. I mean, even though in those days, they didn't do a lot of creative exercises. So maybe for you guys it was different, but for me when I was at Hunter, most of what we did was essays, essays, analysis, reading. But I loved that. I mean, I loved books from the youngest age. Even though I did not take a career in the arts seriously, I loved to read. So I think that was the subject I absolutely loved so much, but didn't take seriously. And, it's true, I guess the poem didn't come from nowhere, but I hadn't had a lot of creative training or support, and I was told by a lot of people that I was bad. I'm not a good writer. So I was in a creative writing workshop when I was at Harvard, and I was just not one of the favorites. And he thought I was okay, but, I was not the star of the class. And it was when I graduated, Professor Helen Wendler at Harvard was one of my mentors, and she was really, really great to me. And she actually told me I had talent as a poet, but she also thought I should stay and do an academic career. And part of me wanted to stay and get my PhD, but part of me really wanted to actually do the creative stuff myself, even though everyone told me I was really not very good at it.
Well, Helen Wendler recently passed away, and it's really powerful to hear that she had such a positive influence. Did you pursue an MFA after college? And tell us about that route, and also how you ended up in the Netherlands.
Right. So I graduated, after being told I was not very good at being a writer, but wanting to be a writer nonetheless. And as one of those, really anal types that we all are in this room, I knew that if I were to get any kind of semi-real job, that would be my life. You know, I knew that I would get sucked into that career and end up 30 years later as, you know, whatever it was I had thought I would do as a day job. So I went to New York City, I wanted to be a writer, and I was like, I need like a contentless job that can pay the bills while I try to write. So I applied for this job watering plants. And it was like watering plants in corporate buildings. And so I was really I went in with my little Harvard diploma and I was like, okay, you know, I am gonna water those plants for you. I'm gonna water them so well. And the guy was like, well, you know, it's not just watering plants. And I'm like, okay, what else is it? And he's like, you also gotta pick off the dead leaves. And I'm like, no problem. I know, not a dead leaf to be seen. I'm gonna do all the dead leaves. So he was like, we don't want you. So I did not get that job. Then I applied for a job. I saw this little...
You would have ended up in charge of facilities management.
Watering all the plants. And you'd see me in the background here, watering the plants. But no, so then I saw an ad in the paper and it said, wanted professional ballroom dancer will train. And I had promised myself a couple of years ago that I would never not do something simply because I was afraid of it. So that was like a life philosophy I had adopted. So obviously, like jumping off the roof, there's a very good reason to be afraid of jumping off the roof. Then that was fine, that I didn't have to do that. But there are times like when you want to go to a party or you want to start a new direction in your life, and the reason you don't do it is because you know, it's because you're scared. You just don't want to do it. And I had promised myself I would never let that be the reason to stop me. So I was scared, but I went in for that audition. I wore the outfit that is in Mambo in Chinatown, my second novel, which was like a turban on my head and like a big sack of a red dress. And I somehow wound up getting that job. So I worked for 3 years as a professional ballroom dancer in New York City. And then I saw Helen Vendler at a Seamus Heaney reading. And she said, Jean, what are you doing with your life these days? And I told her, and she looked at me and she said, Jean, you must return to the flock. And I thought, okay, she's actually right. Like, I actually have gone astray and I probably should return. And so then I applied to get my MFA at Columbia in fiction, and that was the beginning of my professional career as a writer, although there were a lot of ups and downs in breaking through. And I met a Dutch guy, I married him, and then I just divorced him. So I'm just, because usually people are like, oh. So yeah.
That is a remarkable story.
Well, Jean, reading Leftover Woman, it's in many ways it's a feminist novel. It's a very powerful feminist novel. And there's some really problematic men, including the ones who at first appear to be, so good. And I'm curious about these themes of kind of betrayal and secrecy and kind of what people are able to tell to their most intimate partners and what they have to hide, and how you kind of, work through that theme, because it occurs in parallel, as you say, with both of the female protagonists in your book.
Yeah, that's a really insightful question. I mean, I do think there are good men in my book as well, so it's not only bad men, but I do tend to structure my books so that they're like those mirrors with many, many sides. So that Jasmine and Rebecca are mirrors of each other. Jasmine has a dark mirror in the form of Dawn. So Jasmine is a beautiful woman who has been used for how she looks and has actually been sold off at a young age, or as a commodity almost in their village, because they're too few women with this skewed gender ratio now in China. And so, of course, I have to set it up so that when she comes to the US, she's in this impossible situation, and she can't get a job, she's not documented, and her only way out is to accept a job as a cocktail waitress in a strip club. And the reason I do that is because I want that to be the most difficult thing possible for her. She either has to choose to allow herself to be used or to use herself. But then she's on this slippery slope, and they get her in the way they get a lot of young women in by saying they're not going to touch you. We have bouncers everywhere. The exotic dancers, they can be touched, but the cocktail waitresses cannot be touched. All you need to do is serve drinks. It's an easy way to make a lot of money, get out of debt, and just like be able to support yourself. And you're just in a slightly seedy environment, but you will be fine. Of course, this is not true, because as she soon finds out, where the real money is made is in the champagne room, where anything goes. And then I have her, for example, have Dawn, who is a character also in the strip club, who's gone further and who says, well, I fooled around with men who have not treated me very well, and I didn't get any money out of it. So why don't I just, do some things with men and actually get paid for it? So, Jasmine is on this incredibly slippery slope that is set up by the other characters. And it's the same thing with the men in the book, because they're all designed to put pressure on these women in different ways so that we can see what these women are truly made of.
Now, Rebecca, the publisher, she's an editor-in-chief at a prestigious but troubled literary imprint. She has a seemingly perfect marriage with a professor of East Asian Studies at Columbia. Not all, in fact, is well in this marriage. And tell us a little bit about, well, first of all, were these folks based on anyone you've encountered in literary New York?
Yes, of course. The fun thing about writing about publishing is that is a field I know very well. I have a very powerful agent myself, and the agent in the novel is to a large extent based on her, where she was at the National Book Award and 2 of her clients had been nominated.
This is Gina.
Yes, exactly, Gina Park, and in the book. And Rebecca is a top editor. And the fun thing was that when the book went into editing, of course I had my agent and my editor say, oh yes, no, I wouldn't say that. I would say that. We wouldn't do that in an auction situation. We wouldn't get that in Germany. We would get that in, London. But that was fun. But of course, everything in my novels is well researched. I spoke to people in every conceivable situation in the book. So Rebecca is married to a white language prodigy who speaks Chinese perfectly, fluently. And he's a professor of East Asian Studies at Columbia. And he has a line in the book where he says, I was in love with China, but China was never in love with me. And at a certain point, I realized that no matter what I gave to that country, I would never be accepted as one of them. Because the moment they see the color of my skin, I am branded as a foreigner. And that is exactly how so many immigrants feel in America today. But I transplanted that to a white man feeling it in China just to give a different kind of spin on it. So there are a lot of things like that in the book that were really, really interesting to me to write.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about, the theme of kind of mother-daughter love is probably the most central theme in the book. You also write in a very pragmatic way about Chinese immigrants wanting a better life for their children, kind of no matter what it takes. And that kind of struck me in the book, frankly, because essentially the Jasmine character, who's also known as Lucy, but we'll leave that aside, essentially decides that her daughter is in the best possible place she could be.
Well, we can't spoil, right? So
Okay.
Yes.
No plot spoilers
Yes.
here. But tell us a little bit about how you created the world in which these 2 mothers simultaneously share the love of and delight in, their shared daughter in a sense.
Well, the thing was that I created an impossible situation in the book. And when an early reader had read a draft of it, she said to me, you should really make Rebecca into the villain of the novel. And then it would be a very clear emotional read for the reader. The reader's going to be pulling for Jasmine all the way. And the question would be, can she defeat Rebecca or not? And I said, well, I don't want to do that. Because I really have a tremendous amount of sympathy for Rebecca as well as for Jasmine. I mean, Jasmine is, of course, the biological mother who did not know her child was being placed for adoption. So she has a tremendous right to that child. But Rebecca also loves, loves, loves her daughter. And as far as her daughter is concerned, Rebecca is her mother. Rebecca and Brandon, the husband, are her parents. And Rebecca and Brandon can offer the child a life that Jasmine really can't. And I think that that's why adoption is such a complicated issue. And I didn't want to simplify it. I didn't want to make it easier. But of course, the problem with having set up an impossible dilemma is that I had to solve this dilemma. And at one point in the draft or another, I have to tell you, every single character in this book was either like sleeping with each other in jail or dead. Like I had one draft where I killed everybody off, like every single person. And my editor read it and was like, what are you doing? She was like, bring them back to life. No, no, no. I was just like, oh, okay. It seemed kind of dramatic. I thought it was like gonna be strong. She, no, bring them back, bring them back. So, you know, it was a real kind of wrestling match to try to figure out how to come to the conclusion that I believed. And I wanted it to be nuanced. I didn't want it to be a cop-out, not like that they both get the kid, but, you know, that would give the message, because we all read a book, we've been to English class, and we take some kind of moral meaning from the ending. And I wanted it to be an ending that was nuanced, that said this is a very specific situation, and in this particular situation, this decision was made. But, you know, I did not want it to be a book of division, where, because I think this country is divided enough. I did not want it to be a book where it was the two mothers pitted against each other, which of course in some ways it is, but I wanted it to be about how what united them was more important than what divided them.
Yeah, that's really incredibly powerful. And I wanted to ask a little bit about, look, a lot happens in your books. A lot. These are, you know, I read a certain amount of literary fiction that's high on interiority and you know, kind of character psychology and kind of, you know, the external developments are kind of slow to unfold. There's a lot of action in your books, a lot. And I'm curious about that because, you know, there's an element to which Leftover Woman is a melodrama. And I also think that that genre, which I do not underrate, is a genre that actually has always been a very compelling genre in American fiction. And I'm curious about, you know, do you see it as a melodrama? And you know, in producing all these heightened kinds of emotions in a very kind of action-packed plot, like, you know, what kind of effect were you trying to achieve on your readers?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a melodrama, but I do think it's a suspenseful family drama.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to do with my work in general is that I want people to be able to read it on different levels. So that on one level, you can read The Leftover Women or any of my books and have it just be a pulse-pounding thriller and turn the pages for the story alone. Because I think that if you write a novel that is too, you know, trying to preach, what happens is that you lose a vast majority of your readers before you get to the end. And I really believe that, you know, plot has a bad reputation nowadays. It's almost like opposed to being literary. I think it's ridiculous. I think plot is a skill that we have to learn, and that plot is a way of conveying meaning. And indeed, in the book, there's a really big plot twist, and it's a genre plot twist that I use to illustrate the white gaze. So it's about, you know, the book is functioning on different levels. It's on one level a really suspenseful, fun book to read. On another level is a book that can be and is taught in schools about feminism, you know, chauvinism, so many things, race, class, etc. And I designed it that way so that you can, you know, you can be entertained and hopefully illuminated at the same time.
Well, now let's get to, the book bans.
Yes.
I live in a state currently, the state of Texas, where a lot of books are getting banned for, purported, cultural, sexual, or other content that is deemed either age inappropriate or, perhaps too disruptive of the existing social order, or some other reason. And I'm very curious about, your first book, Girl in Translation, has ended up on some of these book ban lists.
Everyone.
How did that come about? How has it affected you as the author, and what are you doing about it?
Yes, so my debut novel, Girl in Translation, is probably my most autobiographical novel. And it's about a smart girl who lives a double life, caught between going to an exclusive private school and her life working in a clothing factory. That book is taught in schools around the world, including someone from Bronx Science just wrote to me, told me that they were reading it. And I think because it is it's considered a modern classic immigration story, it has become a target. And it is on the standard list of books being challenged across the country. It has been removed from shelves in states like Florida and Minnesota and etc. And I heard about it for the first time about a year ago when a mother said, I'm going to try to defend your book, will you write me a letter to read at the defense? And I started writing the letter, and I got more and more riled up and angry, and I was just like, I'm gonna fly in and defend my book myself. So I did, and that talk has gone viral. Because at that time there was very little attention. People did not realize that was happening. That was only a year ago, and now there is much more attention.
Tell us about the hearing. Where was it?
Yeah.
What did you say? What was the pretext that they used to try to?
Right. Okay. So, Girl in Translation is being challenged on grounds of it being pornographic. So then, pornography is in a very sad state, I can tell you. And Girl in Translation is pornographic because there is a website that details what is questionable in the novel. And out of about 300 pages, they flagged 4 pages and 4 words. So there are 4 so-called curse words in the book. They are not called curse words. They're not, the F word doesn't even appear. It's like body parts, right? So 4 words and 4 pages. And in those 4 pages, there is some pot smoking. There is some kissing, no tongues, just kissing. There is one sexual encounter that is a totally fade to black sexual encounter, and one character considers abortion, which incidentally the character does not go through with. That's it. That's all there is in the novel. So it is pretty outrageous that it is on these lists, and it seems really clear that there's another agenda at work in removing these books. There is also a kind of real copy-paste action where it gets on one list and they just take it and they move it on to the other one. But I went and I basically said, I understand the desire to protect our children. Every parent has that right, but we do not protect them by removing books from them. And that we can recognize ourselves in books in a way that is really powerful, and that characters in books can make mistakes that we do not need to make. That actually it is a way for us to live lives and to make mistakes and to find ourselves without, really causing ourselves bodily harm.
And was that before a school board?
Yes.
And what was the outcome?
In that school board, they kept the book, and they were immediately, thank you, and they were immediately like, who wanted to ban that book? That wasn't us, we didn't want to ban the book. It was the Democrats that wanted to ban the book. They made the whole thing out of nothing. So there, it's still on the shelves, but in other places, it's being removed.
And what do you think is what are some of the agendas underlying these book bans and this real, backlash against, frankly, the kind of cultural flourishing we've seen from, a much more multiracial, multi-ethnic, pluralistic array of authors than we necessarily had access to when we were growing up?
I think that, when Girl in Translation was published, it was not usual to have books about people of color. And it wasn't that long ago. It was published in 2010. So, you know, people think that what we have now, we have always had, but it was not true. My first agent said to me about Girl in Translation, there is no market for this book. And by that he meant nobody wants to read about a Chinese girl. So, you know, it is a kind of flourishing that there is such diversity in the market and that there are all of these different types of voices that are being heard now, and there is a backlash against it to get rid of those voices, and I am one of those voices.
Now, Jean, we just have a few more minutes, so I have many more questions, but I would love to invite questions from here, our Hunter alumni audience. So why don't we start with Vivian? Do you mind coming? We'll just speak loudly.
Not a problem. My question is, what is the title, Leftover Woman? Where does that come from?
Another excellent question. So the Leftover Woman has two meanings. One is that within the context of the book, it's a metaphor for how, as women, we are often forced to carve ourselves into many different roles to make ourselves palatable to other people, and it feels sometimes like what we have left is, you know, all we have. But the Leftover Woman is also reference to the current Chinese propaganda campaign against women, which is that, you know, we kind of suffered under the one-child policy for so many years. It was way too effective, so that the birth rate has plummeted. And at this point, what they are hoping to do is to bring it back up, and therefore they are shaming women of a certain age. And of a certain age means above 25, who are not married and not having children, and they are calling them leftover women who are not nurturing society, who are being thrown away like scraps at a table.
Wow.
Hi, I'm Jane Tillman Irving, class of 1965, and is your first book considered young adult, or is that considered an adult book?
It's an adult book, and it is read in schools really by upperclassmen. So it's not being assigned to 13-year-olds. It's, you know, being assigned to like 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. And, you know, I mean, there's a lot of arguments for why this is a non-issue, because of course parents can always say, I don't want this book to be read, but the truth is, if Girl in Translation were a movie, and it is in development for the screen, you know, it would barely get a PG-13 rating. I don't even think it would. I think it'd get a PG rating. So it's insane to argue that it's inappropriate in any traditional sense.
And if I may follow up, are public libraries also trying to restrict its availability?
At this point, the movement is mainly in school libraries, but I was just at the Authors Guild Gala yesterday, and I heard that it is expanding. It is expanding to public libraries. So it's starting in schools, and sometimes what they're doing is they're just quietly taking books off. You know, they're just kind of disappearing off the shelves without going through due procedure, and that it is moving into public libraries.
How are your books received in China? Like, not on the government level, but also on, obviously it's probably bifurcated. You got the government and official versus social.
You know, surprisingly enough, Girl in Translation is one of the Chinese government's favorite books. And because it is a nuanced, negative view of American immigration. So they are kind of like, yeah, they're kind of like, hey guys, it's not as easy as it looks, you know. So actually, while, you know, you think they would be critical of it, they really like that book because it's like they think that it's saying that immigration to the U.S. isn't as rosy as we might think it is. In fact, what's funny is that the Chinese title is, you know, when your book gets published, the title changes all around the world. In the Netherlands, it's called Almost Home. In, you know, Italy, it's called The Road of Secret Desires, you know. So it's like the whole thing. In China, it is translated as A Young Girl Goes to Yale. So that's the title of my book. So yeah, but my other books I'm sure are more controversial.
Fascinating. And you had a question.
Oh, it was such a magical moment when you wrote the poem, you know, and I was wondering if you still have that poem or what it was about.
Yeah, it was a poem that was it was about a boy I knew, of course, and we had, I don't know if you remember, but at that age, the line between like friendship and like boyfriend is very vague, and we had one of these ambiguous relationships where it was like we were kind of friends with benefits, but not really, you know, we spent a lot of time together, and he would sleep over, we'd hang out, but we wouldn't fool around, except once or twice we did, you know, and then it turned out that I was a physics major at that point, and he was really, you know, was really kind of cool and became cool and political. You know how people go to college and they kind of find themselves and they find their identity. And I think I became not cool enough for him. So he suddenly kind of disappeared from my life, and I was feeling sad about it. So I wrote a poem about it that night.
But you have it? You have it?
No, I don't have it anymore. I know. And he doesn't deserve it anyway. So.
He really doesn't. He's a big nobody. So
Imagine what he thinks next.
He doesn't know. He doesn't know.
So Jean, it's really remarkable that in less than 15 years, you've gone from your debut, Girl in Translation, Mambo in Chinatown, Searching for Sylvie Lee, now Leftover Woman, published last October. What is next for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm working on a new book right now, and it is actually, you know, so the thing about divorce is that when you have gone through the kind of divorce that I have gone through, I used to have trouble writing like scary, dark stuff. And in fact, I have to tell you, in fact, my last, The Leftover Women had these scenes that I thought were scary, and they were along the lines of, you know, the antagonist was stomping on these white flowers. And my editor was like, how is that scary? And I'm like, you don't understand. I'm like, he's stomping really hard. And she's like, that is not scary. And I'm like, well, you don't get it, Jessica, because, you know, do you know what like type of flowers they are? I'm like, they're jasmine flowers. Do you know what my heroine's name is? Jasmine. I'm like, it's symbolic. And she's like, it's still not scary. Like, this is no good. But so the fact is, she made me cut all of this stuff. But having been through this divorce, I now really understand like homicide. So I'm going like darker. I can write murder now. And so yes, my new book is a murder set at Harvard, and there is a murdering secret society of women. So yes, it's really, and in fact, I don't know if any of you did go to Harvard, but if you did, the Adams House swimming pool. So the Adams House was one of the houses, and it has a swimming pool where everyone would swim naked. And it was not a official sanctioned thing, of course, but everyone still did it. Like, you knew where the key was, you know, and in the night, everybody would turn off the lights and go swim naked in the pool, and all sorts of horrible things would happen there. And now there's going to be a murder as well.
Wow. Jean Kwok, Hunter alum, best-selling novelist, author of The Leftover Woman, and a really, really entertaining conversation. Thank you so much.